I got fired at 9:22 in the morning, though the HR director acted like she was canceling a dentist appointment impersonal, rushed eager to move on. She slid a thin packet across the table without raising her eyes. My keycard stopped working before I even reached the lobby, the scanner blinking red as the security guard gave a sympathetic shrug. The building's glass doors closed behind me with a soft click. That sound was the only acknowledgement that the last 4 years of my life had been erased in less than 10 minutes. The sun felt harsh, almost mocking. Commuters moved around me with purpose, while I stood frozen on the sidewalk, gripping a cardboard box that held nearly nothing, a half-dead succulent, a notepad, and the mechanical pencil I carried everywhere. Cars rushed past, sunlight bounced off windows, and everything kept moving as if the world hadn't just shifted underneath my feet. My phone buzzed. Dad. I stared at his name until the screen dimmed. Whenever he called, I braced myself. His voice had a way of shrinking me no matter how old I became. I answered anyway. Avery, he said, clipped and disappointed. I heard what happened. My stomach tightened. It wasn't a performance issue. He didn't let me finish. Companies don't release valuable people. They release the ones who don't contribute. I warned you about chasing unstable positions. Your brother made choices that lead somewhere. You chose idealism. This is the result. His words landed like stones, heavy and familiar. Dad, it wasn't... You need to face reality, he said sharply. You've been drifting for years. Maybe now you'll understand why I never believed you were ready for more responsibility. Cole is getting promoted next month, and he's earned it. Meanwhile, you... His voice faltered for a split second, then hardened. You keep proving exactly why I never expected much. Something in me pulled tight, then quieted. Not loudly, just a small, clean shift that felt long overdue. I have to go, I said. He exhaled in that irritated way he saved for me. Running off again. Typical. The line went dead. I lowered the phone slowly, my hands trembling. A few passers-by glanced at me with that uncomfortable look strangers give when they sense something private opening up. Another buzz. Cole, Dad's in a mood. Maybe don't come home. Of course. My family's solution to discomfort was always avoidance. Better to shove the problem aside than face it. I walked the 12 blocks to my car without noticing most of my surroundings. My legs moved because they had to, not because my mind was guiding them. When I finally slid into the driver's seat, I buried my face in my hands. I expected tears, real ones. Instead, only a hollow heat burned behind my eyes. I didn't drive home. I headed toward the overlook outside Ridgeview, the place I used to hide when school felt crushing, or when Dad's disappointment hung too heavily over the dinner table. It had always been my unofficial refuge, a place where no one demanded anything from me. The valley spread out below as I parked glittering faintly under late morning light. Wind brushed over the hood of the car, carrying the faint scent of eucalyptus from the hills. I let my forehead rest against the steering wheel, trying to breathe past the ache lodged deep in my chest. Eventually, I reached for the notebook lying on the passenger seat. It had followed me through college internships and countless nights wrestling with ideas I was never confident enough to pursue. I flipped it open out of habit. Blank pages stared back, quiet, expectant. Something shifted, then subtle but unmistakable. The shame of losing my job still stung, but beneath it, another feeling stirred restlessness, maybe even curiosity. I had been clinging to a job that never valued me, trying to impress a father who had never believed in me, and pretending I didn't want more. I picked up the pencil. This time, it didn't squeak. I began writing, not neatly, not thoughtfully, just fast. Concepts I'd whispered to myself but never dared to build, poured out in uneven lines. I sketched an interface, outlined early architecture ideas, and scribbled potential features. My hand was cramped, but I kept moving. Page after page filled until my wrist throbbed. By the time I stopped, the wind had grown stronger, tugging at the loose papers. A strange steadiness settled over me. Losing my job hadn't emptied my life. It had cleared space. My phone lit up again. Veronica Lynn, senior producer, National Network Media. I blinked at the name, unsure why a national journalist would reach out to me on the same day everything fell apart. Her message was brief. Avery, I'm working on a segment about ethical innovation in tech. Your name was recommended. Are you open to a conversation? My breath stalled. Recognition. Real recognition was finally coming from somewhere other than the people who'd spent years underestimating me. A second text arrived before I processed the first. I would love to talk today if possible. I closed the notebook and held it against my chest, letting the meaning settle. It struck me then that I hadn't been lost at all. The work I'd been shaping quietly for years had been working for me in silence, inching toward something bigger than I ever admitted. And the voices that tried to shrink me, every prediction, every dismissal, were about to meet with a truth none of them had ever imagined. The wind pushed against my car door as I stepped out at the Ridgeview overlook, the notebook still warm from where I'd been clutching it. Veronica's messages hovered in my mind like a spark I was almost afraid to touch. I read them again, half convinced they would vanish if I blinked too long. The idea of a national producer reaching out to me felt unreal. No connection to my family, no bias, no expectations, no history. She wasn't seeing the version of me my dad dissected, or the afterthought my brother treated like background noise. Whoever had recommended my name had done so because of the work itself, and that alone sent a complicated rush through my chest. Before I could overthink, I typed a response. "I can meet this afternoon. Just tell me where." A few seconds passed. "Then name the place that reflects what matters most in your work." I looked around. The overlook didn't represent anything I built. It represented everything I'd escaped. But less than 3 miles away, tucked behind the old river path, stood a neglected plot of land that once belonged to a city sustainability project, an abandoned greenhouse made of glass arches and rusted support beams. I'd visited it during college while working on a community eco-design paper. The structure was falling apart now, but even in its decay, I'd always felt something raw and promising there. I sent the location. Her reply came instantly. 1 hour. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. 1 hour. Not enough time to prepare. Not enough time to pretend, definitely not enough time to turn myself into the polished professional my father believed I failed at becoming. It terrified me. It thrilled me. I started the engine, my fingers trembling on the steering wheel, the whole drive down the winding road. The closer I got to the river, the more the landscape changed. Tall eucalyptus trees closing over the road, their scent rising like memories. My mind drifted to old conversations I never should have replayed. Dad dismissed my capstone project. Cole asked why I bothered with tech for people who can't afford tech. Mom gently suggested I choose something safer. For years, their warnings shaped the borders of my ambition. Today, for the first time, those borders broke open. The abandoned greenhouse came into view, its rusted arches tall, skeletal, elegant, in a way no one bothered to appreciate anymore. The glass panels were cloudy from years of coastal wind, but sunlight still slipped through in fractured beams. I parked beside a faded maintenance sign and stepped out the smell of the riverbank. For a moment, I let the quiet fill me. Then I heard footsteps on gravel. A woman approached, mid-40s, black hair, pulled neatly back slate blue blazer, purposeful stride. She moved like someone used to walking into rooms where she was listening to. "You must be Avery," she said, offering her hand. Her voice was warm, not performative, and it immediately grounded me. "I'm Veronica," she continued. "Thank you for meeting on such short notice." I nodded, praying she couldn't hear the frantic beat under my ribcage. "Thank you for reaching out. I still don't know how my work got onto your radar." She smiled in a way that suggested she liked that question. "A professor from Carmichael University mentioned you. Something about an ethical systems prototype that demonstrated promise." My mind scrambled. Carmichael. Professor Hewitt. He'd once told me my early models were quietly brilliant, in a way that didn't demand applause. I never knew he'd remembered my name after graduation. Veronica walked in a slow arc, studying the greenhouse. Why this place? I hesitated before answering, because it's the first spot where I ever believed sustainable tech could belong outside a lab. The structure is broken, but it was designed with purpose. I always wanted to rebuild it. She nodded thoughtfully. "Tell me what you've been working on." I opened my notebook not to show her yet, but because I needed something to anchor my hands. Adaptive microgrids, I said. Low-cost energy modules that adjust to weather and community habits. Systems that priority. She lifted a hand gently. Don't pitch. Talk. The subtle difference unraveled something inside me. So I did. I told her about the models I tested in my apartment, the failures that taught me more than the successes, the nights when code swam in front of my eyes, and I kept going anyway. I talked about my goal to create energy independence for neighborhoods that big companies overlooked because they weren't profitable enough. I talked until my throat tightened from the honesty of it. Veronica listened without interrupting her expression, focused but not harsh. When I finally stopped unsure whether I'd ruined everything by oversharing, she stepped closer to the fractured glass. You know what I see? She asked quietly. I braced myself. A founder. She turned toward me. Not an employee who got pushed out. A builder. Someone who doesn't realize how far ahead she actually is. My breath caught not from the compliment, but from how fiercely I wanted to believe it. Then she added, but I also see someone who's been told too many times that she's not enough. That kind of voice clings to you. It takes effort to undo. I swallowed hard. She checked her watch. My crew is nearby. We're filming several segments this week, but your story, your perspective fits something bigger than a tech profile. I want to feature your work, Avery. Not your job loss, not your family history, your ideas. The world tilted. You want to put me on camera? I asked barely above a whisper. I want to put your vision on camera, she corrected, if you're willing. The river wind picked up, lifting strands of my hair across my cheek. Behind me, sunlight flared through the broken glass, scattering across the dirt like a promise. It hit me then, really hit me. My dad's voice didn't matter here. Cole's smirk had no place in this space. The years of being underestimated had no seat in this conversation. For the first time in my life, someone powerful wasn't asking me to fit into a box. She was asking me to step out of one. I'm willing, I said. And I meant every word. The greenhouse air felt warmer than the outside breeze, as if the glass still remembered the last time sunlight mattered here. I pushed open the rusted door, and Veronica followed her phone already out as she scanned the curved beams and crooked light patterns drifting across the dirt floor. She took in the entire structure, the way a documentarian studies a subject quietly with intention. This place has a story, she murmured. I stepped over a fallen beam and nodded. The city abandoned the project after funding dried up. No one wanted to take on the repairs. But you did, she said. I didn't argue, even though I'd never had the money or authority to fix anything here. What I carried, though, was the instinct to redesign things people gave up on. Maybe because I understood the feeling too well. She pivoted toward me, slipping her phone into her blazer pocket. I want you to show me whatever you're comfortable sharing. No pressure, no camera, just you and your work. The weight of that invitation hit harder than her initial text. I opened my notebook to the page I had filled during the emotional aftermath of my firing messy lines, half-formed shapes, a chaos that somehow made sense to me. My voice shook a little as I described the interface I'd been building, how the system predicted community usage patterns and altered energy flow before shortages occurred. Veronica didn't blink or pretend to understand. She listened deeply, and when she asked questions, they weren't shallow or patronizing. She wanted the truth, not the polished version. Your mind works in patterns, she observed, but the system you design works from empathy. I blinked, startled by the clarity of it. Most people accused me of being too emotional to operate in tech, as if compassion muddled numbers, as if care diluted precision. Yet here was someone who saw the connection instead of the conflict. She pointed toward the rear of the greenhouse. Walk me through how you'd redesign this space if you could. I hesitated. Without a budget, without limits. The words startled a quiet ache awake inside me. For so long, every idea had been shaped by what other people believed I wasn't allowed to want. I approached the archway, touching one of the cracked panels with care. I'd keep the framework. The bones are good. They just need reinforcement. I knelt, running my fingers along a line of rust. The real transformation would come from the systems added beneath this self-regulating panels, recycled water reservoirs, air filtration made from native plants. Veronica stepped closer, studying the shape of my hands, tracing the old metal. You see potential in things people label broken. I almost laughed. If I didn't, I would have given up on myself years ago. She didn't smile. She absorbed the weight of it. A distant engine rumbled outside. She checked through the door, then turned back to me. My crew will be arriving soon. Before they get here, I want us on the same page. I'm not here to spin a sob story about a fired employee trying to reinvent her life. That narrative is too small for what you've built. Her tone sharpened, not unkind, but precise. This is bigger. What you're creating touches ethics, energy, justice, and community independence. I want the audience to see who you are before anyone, your former company, your family, anyone claims the narrative. My breath hitched. Nobody had ever cared about protecting my story before. Most people grabbed it, twisted it, or used it as proof of everything I lacked. She took a step closer. Avery, has anyone ever taken your work seriously? My answer wasn't immediate. I sifted through memories, late nights, whispering apologies to myself for not being enough meetings where my ideas were waved aside, dinners where Dad shook his head at every decision I made. I don't think so, I finally said. Well, she replied softly, that ends today. The greenhouse door creaked open again before I could respond. A man with a camera slung over one shoulder stepped inside, followed by another carrying sound equipment. They nodded politely and began setting up near the cleanest patch of floor. Veronica turned back to me. Remember, this isn't a test. It's an introduction. My heart was hammered anyway. Cameras had always represented judgment in my mind, exposure, vulnerability. But she wasn't asking me to perform, she was asking me to exist. She directed me toward the arch of light falling through one of the intact panels. The sun hit the dust in the air like glitter suspended in stillness. Stand there, she said. I want natural light on your face. I didn't pose. I didn't straighten my clothes or try to smile. I just breathed. Her cameraman adjusted the focus. Are we rolling? Soon she answered, then turned back to me. Before we start, I want to ask something unrelated to your work. Her voice lowered. What do you want people to understand about you that they've never understood before? I stiffened. The question hit a place I usually kept locked, but the truth rose before I could censor it, that I'm not the fragile one everyone thinks I am. The words came out quiet but steady. I break, but I rebuild, and I don't need permission to try again. Veronica's expression softened, not with pity, but with recognition. Good, she said. Hold on to that. She stepped away and spoke to the crew. All right, let's begin. As the first red recording light blinked on, a calm washed over me, not because I felt ready, but because for the first time in my life, someone believed I didn't need to be rescued to be seen. The camera lens found me, but instead of shrinking, I stood my ground. Light poured through the fractured glass above, scattering across the dirt. And somewhere deep beneath my ribs, the quiet understanding settled. This moment wasn't happening to me. It was happening for me. The first question came before I even found my footing in front of the camera. Veronica stood just outside the frame, her arms loosely crossed, eyes sharp with focus. Tell me, she said, when did you first realize the traditional tech world wasn't built for the kind of work you wanted to do? A beam of sunlight hit my cheek through a fractured panel. Dust hovered in the air like a waiting audience. I didn't look at the camera. I looked at her. It felt safer. It wasn't one moment I said, more like a steady drip of being told my priorities were naive. When was the earliest she pressed? I exhaled slowly, letting the truth rise through years of noise. College, I answered. I built a community grid model for a capstone project. It was simple, not flashy, but it worked. And my Professor Hewitt said it mattered. Everyone else said it wasn't profitable enough to waste time on. Veronica nodded for me to continue. I swallowed hard. When I started working at my old company, I kept proposing similar ideas. Every time they'd smile and tell me it was nice, like a school project, like I was still a kid chasing a science fair ribbon. The cameraman adjusted the angle. The small movement sharpened my awareness that my words were becoming permanent. Did you ever believe them? She asked. I didn't answer right away. The greenhouse creaked softly in the wind. Beyond the doorway, the river glimmered faintly. I think I did, I admitted. I stopped showing them my real ideas. I'd write things down but never submit them. I'd stay late to build prototypes, but I'd hide them in my desk or take them home before anyone could ask questions. "And why hide?" she asked gently. "Because I was tired of looking foolish," I said. "Tired of being the only one who thought differently." Veronica stepped closer to the edge of the shot. "Different isn't foolish, Avery. Different is a threat to the status quo." My stomach tightened, not with fear, but with the weight of being unmistakably understood. The camera light blinked. "Let's go deeper," she said. "What inspired your current design, the adaptive grid?" I lifted my notebook, flipping to the page filled with freshly scribbled architecture lines. I started building it during the blackout 2 years ago. My entire neighborhood went dark for 14 hours. Folks down the street kept knocking, asking if I knew why the power failed or how long it would take to restore. Veronica motioned to the cameraman. He zoomed in slightly, catching the way my fingers brushed over the graphite strokes. I didn't have answers. I continued, but the outage exposed how fragile our systems were. One failure point, and everything crumbled. So I designed something that wouldn't crumble, something that could adapt before a collapse instead of reacting after. "And no one at your company took that seriously?" she asked. A short, humorless breath escaped me. "They didn't even read it. My supervisor said it was outside departmental scope. Translation, not their idea, so not worthwhile." The sound tech raised a hand. "Wind's picking up on the mic." We paused while he adjusted the shield. Veronica used the break to study the old greenhouse beams again. Her eyes traced the structure with the same curiosity she used on me, measured, assessing, quietly impressed. When the crew signaled they were ready, she turned back to me. "Let's talk about the day you were fired." My chest tightened, though I expected the transition. "What do you want to know?" I asked. "What mattered most to you at that moment?" she said. "Not how it happened, not the humiliation, not my father's voice tearing through me, just the core." I let the truth surface. "Relief," I said quietly. It stunned me. I was supposed to feel devastated. Instead, it felt like someone finally snapped a chain I didn't realize I'd been dragging. Veronica's expression shifted approval, maybe. "Say more." "I'd been shrinking myself for that job," I said, pretending I didn't want more, pretending their vision was mine. The firing hurt, but underneath the sting was this space. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of it. The greenhouse door banged softly from the wind. A panel loosened somewhere overhead. Light flickered across the floor. The cameraman lowered the lens slightly. Veronica stepped fully into the frame now, though we both knew most of what she said would be cut. Her presence felt intentional. "Every founder has a catalyst," she said. "A moment when the world stops giving them permission and they build anyway. Sounds like you found yours." I blinked, startled by the word she chose. Founder. No one had ever spoken to me with seriousness before. The title felt too big for the skin I wore. But standing here in the broken greenhouse I'd always wanted to restore, with my notebook full of ideas pressed against my palms, it suddenly didn't feel impossible. Veronica's phone buzzed. She glanced at it once, then looked back at me. "We're adding one more segment today," she said. "Something spontaneous. I want to capture you explaining your system directly, not rehearsed, not sanitized, just you on the floor building with what you have." "Right now?" I asked. "Right now." My pulse quickened. "I don't have materials." "You have a notebook," she said, "and conviction. That's more than enough." She crouched beside a broken planter and brushed off the dirt. "Use this as your table." I moved to the floor, smoothing a stable surface. Veronica motioned for the cameraman to adjust the height. "Show me how it works," she said. I opened my notebook to a clean page and drew the core module first 3 lines intersecting in a curved grid spiraling outward. My hand steadied. The fear that usually haunted my movements dissolved. I sketched the adaptive nodes, the batteryless reservoir, and the surge response map. Her crew didn't interrupt. They filmed as if witnessing a rare kind of unfolding. When I finished, Veronica leaned in, eyes fixed on the shapes. "This is more than tech. This is philosophy." I felt heat build behind my eyes, not sadness, but something sturdier. She straightened. "Let's get this on record. We'll do another take outside with the river in the background, then we'll move to the city's overlook." My breath hitched. "The overlook. A place that matters to you should be part of your story," she said. "Authenticity reads on camera." I stood slowly, dust brushed from my jeans. The greenhouse felt different now, less abandoned, more alive, as if the idea of restoration had already begun reshaping it. As the crew packed up equipment, Veronica placed a steady hand on my shoulder. "Avery," she said, her voice low, "prepare yourself. Once this goes public, your world won't look the same." The wind pushed through the broken panels again, scattering light across the floor. For the first time, the change didn't scare me. It called to me. The drive home felt strangely calm, almost suspended, as if the afternoon had folded itself into a pocket I wasn't ready to open. The shoot at the greenhouse had stretched longer than expected. Veronica filmed 3 different sequences each, layered with questions that reached straight into places I'd spent years avoiding. By the time we wrapped, the sun had dropped low enough to tint the river gold. For a moment, I wanted to stay there somewhere between who I'd been that morning and whoever I was turning into. But I needed to face the real world before it caught me off guard. The moment I pulled into my parents' driveway, that fragile calm evaporated. Dad's truck sat crooked near the garage the way he always parked when irritated. The living room curtains were open, and through the window I could see my brother leaning over the back of the couch arguing with someone out of frame. Mom paced near the kitchen entryway, wringing her hands. They already knew. Of course they did. News traveled faster in my family than common sense. I stepped out of the car and hadn't even closed the door when the front entrance swung open. Cole barreled onto the porch first. "There you are," he snapped. "Why didn't you answer your phone?" "I was busy," I said, and it came out steadier than I expected. "Busy?" he scoffed. "Dad's losing it inside." He heard everything. I inwardly braced. "Everything what?" "That you got fired," he said, "and that you didn't come home, and that you're off doing something impulsive." His words. Dad appeared in the doorway before I could respond. His face was flushed with frustration, and when his eyes landed on me, a familiar disappointment settled over his features. Inside. Now. It wasn't a request. Mom lingered behind him, eyes flicking to me with a mix of worry and guilt she never verbalized. I followed them into the living room. The tension pressed down on the house like humidity. The TV was still on, muted, an evening news banner scrolling across the bottom. A new segment preview flashed on screen, emerging ecotech innovators to watch, Veronica's network. My pulse stuttered. Dad didn't notice. He was too focused on the lecture he'd been storing up. "What were you thinking?" he demanded. "Losing your job and then disappearing." "Do you have any idea how irresponsible I wasn't disappearing?" I said. He ignored that. "You didn't call. You didn't explain yourself. Instead, you run off like I wasn't running," I repeated. Cole threw his hands up. "Here we go," Mom murmured gently. "Honey, maybe let her." Dad silenced her with a hand. "You were fired for a reason, Avery. And instead of reflecting on what you did wrong, you're out." "What?" "Having a picnic, driving around while your family is worried sick." The anger building in my chest wasn't explosive. It was slow rising like water filling a glass. "I had a meeting," I said, keeping my voice even. Dad blinked. "A meeting with who?" "No one in this town is hiring in your field." "It wasn't for a job." Cole scoffed again. "So a hobby thing?" "Great." Mom looked torn. Dad crossed his arms. "Explain." The truth hovered like a spark, risky but alive. "A producer contacted me," I said, "from National Network Media. They want to feature my work on an ecotech segment." Silence dropped over the room. Cole blinked like he didn't understand the words. Mom's mouth fell open. Dad stared as if I'd spoken in another language. He recovered first. "A producer," he repeated as if testing the word for lies. "For what reason?" "For my research," I said. "My adaptive grid model, the one I worked on for 2 years. His laugh was soft, disbelieving. "Avery, no one is interested in that little experiment. Don't you see they're using you for a cheap headline?" The comment hit deeper than I wished it did. "It's not an experiment," I said, forcing my tone steady. "It's a working design, and they want to film a full segment around it." Cole sat back on the couch, eyebrows raised. You? On TV? Yes, I said simply. Mom touched her chest. Oh, sweetheart. What exactly did they say? That my work shows potential, I answered. That what I'm building matters, that they want the public to see it. Dad shook his head. They're using you, he said. Probably want a sob story. Fired employee trying to reinvent herself. People like you are easy to exploit. People like me, I echoed. He didn't hesitate. Soft-hearted, emotional, hungry for validation. The old ache throbbed years of that tone, that evaluation, that unshakable belief that I was fragile where Cole was strong. I'm not being exploited, I said. They reached out because of the work. He dismissed that with a wave. You don't build real tech. You doodle in notebooks and get lost in your imagination. Cole nodded as if that settled it. Mom flinched. Something inside me shifted. Not anger, not fear, something sharper and cleaner. A refusal. Did either of you ever read anything I built? I asked quietly. Dad stiffened. How about you, Cole? Have you ever looked at any of my prototypes? He frowned. Why would I? It's not my field. Exactly, I said. None of you know the first thing about what I do, but somehow you believe you're experts on what I'm capable of. Dad's jaw tightened. We're your family. We know you. You know the version you decided I was, I replied. Not the person who's been building something real behind all your assumptions. The room went still. I took a breath. The producer wants another meeting. They want to film additional footage next week. And I'm going. Dad's face reddened. Absolutely not. I stepped back. I'm an adult. You don't get to decide that anymore. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Mom whispered, Avery, you're shaking. I was, but not from fear this time. I held my ground. You can doubt me if you want. You always have. But it doesn't change what's happening. I'm moving forward. A chime sounded from the TV. The news teaser returned Ecotech Innovators Rising, and this time a flash of the greenhouse scene clipped onto the screen. My breath caught. Dad stared at it, stunned. Mom covered her mouth with her hands. Cole's eyes widened. Is that you? I didn't need to answer. The room already knew. Everything had changed. The next morning felt strangely quiet, the kind of stillness that shows up right before weather turns. I expected Dad to storm into the kitchen and lecture me before I'd even poured my coffee. But when I came downstairs, he wasn't there. Mom sat at the table, hands wrapped around a mug she clearly wasn't drinking from. Her eyes moved from the window to me, then back again, like she wasn't sure whether to speak. You slept late, she finally said. I barely slept. I admitted grabbing my own mug and filling it. Did Dad go to work? He left early, she answered, hesitating. He wanted to get ahead of things. I'm not sure what that means. I knew exactly what it meant. He didn't want to talk to me until he'd figured out a way to turn everything back into my fault. Mom's voice softened. That clip on TV. I didn't know you were doing anything like that. I sat across from her. You never asked. She winced, the reaction so small most people would have missed it. I thought you were just keeping busy. I was building something I said, for years. Her fingers tightened around her mug. Your father says it's dangerous to chase dreams that don't pay the bills. Funny, I said quietly, that every dream I've ever had was dismissed before I was allowed to try. She opened her mouth as if to respond, then closed it again. Silence folded between us. A knock rattled the front door. Mom was startled. Are we expecting anyone? No, I said. The knocking came again, firmer this time. When I opened the door, a woman in a tailored jacket stood on the porch, holding a clipboard and wearing a network badge around her neck. Hi, she said brightly. Avery Holden. I nodded, startled. I'm Tessa from National Network Media. Veronica asked me to drop off release forms and a filming outline for next week. She said you might prefer hard copies before the next call. My mother appeared behind me, eyes widening at the sight of the badge. You're from the television crew, she asked, voice trembling with disbelief. That's right, Tessa smiled. We're excited. The early clip we aired last night tested extremely well with viewers. My breath caught. Is it already tested? Oh, yes. Your concept sparked a lot of internal interest. People love emerging tech stories, especially when they come from unexpected places. Unexpected, a word that fits my family perfectly. Tessa handed me the packet, then leaned in a little. Also, a senior segment director wants to meet you on site next week. He's thinking of expanding your feature into something longer than originally planned. I blinked. Longer as in a full profile. Possibly, she said, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret. But Veronica wants to break that news herself. Just be ready. Mom's hand gripped the side of the doorway. Tessa waved politely and headed back to her car. When she drove off, the silence she left behind was almost physical. My mother finally spoke barely above a whisper. A full profile. Maybe I said, trying to sound casual, even as adrenaline lit up my chest. Nothing is confirmed. She stepped closer. Avery, why didn't you tell us you were building something that mattered like this? I looked at her for a long moment. Would you have believed me? Her reaction answered for her. Before she could say anything else, Dad's truck lumbered down the driveway, stopping with a crunch of gravel. He got out, slammed the door, and walked toward the house with a stiff, determined stride. Something was clutched in his hand. He stepped onto the porch, looked at me, then at Mom. "We need to talk," he said. Mom's face paled. "What is that?" Dad held up a printed email, the company header visible even from where I stood. "They reached out to me today," he said, voice heavy with accusation. I frowned. "Who did?" "The network," he replied, asking if I could provide insight into your upbringing for their segment. The floor seemed to tilt. "They contacted you," I said slowly. He nodded, jaw tightening. "Apparently they want context. They didn't say it, but I know how these things work. They're digging, looking for someone to say you overcame something tragic or dramatic, some angle." "That's not what they're doing," I said. He laughed bitterly. "Of course it is. They don't care about your work. They want the story. And you're letting them twist our family for entertainment. That's not true. They're going to make me look like I held you back." My breath caught. "Did you—" His eyes sparked with anger. "I pushed you because you needed structure. If I didn't challenge you, you'd waste your life chasing every idea that entered your head." Mom whispered. "David, no," he snapped. "She needs to hear this. The world isn't waiting for her genius. You're not some visionary. You never have been." I didn't realize my hands were shaking until my mug rattled against the table. Dad continued, voice rising. "And now a television crew wants to act like you built something meaningful. It's absurd. The same old narrative, the same certainty that I'd never measure up. But this time, something inside me refused to fold. I didn't ask them to call you," I said. "I didn't bring you into this." "You brought embarrassment," he shot back. "No," I said, straightening. "I brought the truth." For a moment, everything went silent. Mom held her breath. Cole, who had appeared at the top of the stairs, froze mid-step. Dad stared at me like he couldn't quite recognize the person standing in front of him. "You think this will last?" he demanded. "A spotlight. A segment. It'll fade. Then what? You'll still be the same person with unrealistic dreams and no direction." I took a slow breath, feeling the last remnants of fear unravel. "I'm not the same person," I said. He shook his head and stepped back like the conversation was done, but he paused at the door, his voice low and sharp. "You're making a mistake, and when this falls apart, don't expect me to clean up the mess." He walked out before I could respond. Mom covered her mouth, eyes glistening. Cole looked anywhere but at me. I didn't chase after Dad. The door closed, the echo settling like dust. For the first time in years, I felt the weight shift not onto me, but off me. They could either catch up to who I was becoming or get left behind. 3 days later, the crew van pulled into my parents' driveway just after 10 in the morning. I'd warned Mom it was coming, but I don't think she fully believed it until she saw the equipment cases rolling across the lawn and a boom mic lifting into the air like some metal creature unfolding its limbs. She froze beside the kitchen counter, one hand still resting on the handle of the dishwasher she'd been loading. "My goodness," she whispered. "They're really here." "They are," I said, trying to stay calm even as my stomach twisted. Outside, the sound of car doors and footsteps filled the quiet street. Neighbors peeked from windows. A couple walking their dog slowed down and openly stared. In this town, a parked news van might as well be a UFO landing. Veronica stepped out last. Sharp jacket, tailored pants hair, pulled back in a practical but elegant twist. She carried herself with a confidence that made the entire yard feel like her set. When she spotted me through the open front door, she broke into a warm smile. "Avery," she said, crossing the walkway quickly, "I've been looking forward to this." Mom hovered behind me, unsure whether to stay or flee. When Veronica reached the porch, I stepped aside. "Come in," I said. "Sorry for the chaos." "We bring chaos," she replied with an easy laugh. "It's part of the job." Her crew followed her inside, assessing lighting, peering down hallways, murmuring about wide shots and angles. Mom's gaze darted between them like she'd accidentally walked into a foreign country and lost her phrase book. "Your home is lovely," Veronica said. Mom flushed. "It's not much, but we keep it tidy." "It's warm," Veronica replied. "Warm matters more." Dad wasn't home by some miracle, or maybe he simply didn't want to witness any of this. After our argument, he'd avoided me like approaching me might confirm some uncomfortable truth he didn't want to face. Veronica surveyed the living room thoughtfully. "We'll do a quick interview here before we head to your workspace. I want viewers to see the environment you started in." Mom stiffened. "Workspace?" "Yes," I said slowly. "She means my design room." Mom blinked. What room?" Veronica turned to me. "You didn't tell her I rubbed the back of my neck. It's the old guest room. I converted it a while ago." Mom stared at me like I'd confessed to demolishing the garage. When she asked, "A year ago. And you didn't tell us?" I exhaled. It never felt like something that mattered to anyone here, that hurt her. I could see it in the way her hand drifted to her throat, a habit she used when words failed. Before the silence grew too heavy, Veronica cleared her throat. "Why don't we start upstairs?" she suggested. We led her up to the room at the end of the hall. When I pushed the door open, the smell of old paper and electronics drifted out. The room was small, just a single desk. 2 monitors, stacks of notebooks, sketches pinned up the wall, circuit boards scattered in labeled bins. To me, it was everything. To Mom, it must have looked like a secret she'd never realized her daughter was carrying right under her roof. Veronica stopped at the doorway, taking it all in with a slow, appreciative nod. "This is perfect," Mom whispered Avery. Her voice held something I didn't recognize at first: awe. The crew squeezed into the room, adjusting lights and clearing a corner for the camera. Veronica motioned for me to sit at my desk, then crouched beside one of the notebooks. "You work in layers," she said, flipping through a page filled with interface sketches. "You build the logic first, then the user flow, then the physical integration." Mom looked at me startled. "You drew all of that?" "Yes, and built it, some of it. Enough for a model." She slowly touched one of the pinned sketches, a grid layout with shifting nodes. "All this time? I thought you were just doodling." I swallowed. "I know." The interview began shortly after. Veronica positioned herself across from me while the camera rolled. Her questions weren't soft. They probed deeper than I expected. "What drove you to start building adaptive systems in the first place? How did your environment influence your work? What did you feel you didn't have growing up that you had to create for yourself?" Mom sat just out of frame, hands locked in her lap. Every time Veronica asked a question about family influence or limitations, Mom flinched like she expected me to expose something cruel. But I didn't. I told the truth without sharpening it. I didn't grow up in a family that understood technology, I said, or imagination. I learned to keep my ideas quiet because I didn't want to disappoint anyone. Mom's breath hitched. "But quiet doesn't mean gone." I continued. "Sometimes the things we bury become the foundations we build on." The crew shifted, sensing the emotional weight. When the interview wrapped upstairs, Veronica suggested capturing some exterior shots. As they moved outside, Mom remained behind, standing in the middle of the room like she was seeing it for the first time. "Why didn't you show us this?" she asked, because every time I tried to share ideas when I was younger, I said gently, the room got quieter, like I'd said something embarrassing. She lowered herself into my desk chair. Her fingers brushed the keyboard hesitantly, like touching it might reveal answers she'd never asked for. "I never meant to make you feel small," she whispered. "I know," I replied, but the silence did. Footsteps thundered up the stairs. Cole appeared at the door, breathless. "Avery, Dad's on his way back." He looked bad. Mom stood abruptly. "Bad how?" He drove off earlier after yelling into his phone, something about the network and reputation, and not letting this go any further. My stomach tightened. I knew exactly what was coming. Veronica called from downstairs, Avery ready for the outdoor shots. I turned toward her voice. And behind me, Mom whispered the words I never expected to hear from her. "Whatever storm he brings through that door, you don't face it alone." It was the first fracture in the story my family had told about me for years. And fractures have a way of becoming openings. Dad's truck turned onto the street before we even finished setting up the first exterior shot. The rumble of the engine echoed across the neighborhood like a warning. Veronica glanced toward the sound, unfazed, but my chest tightened. Cole moved a step closer to me, uncertain whether to intervene or run for cover. Mom stepped onto the porch, wringing her hands. "David, please don't start anything." He barely acknowledged her. His focus locked on Veronica and the camera crew. "What is all this?" he demanded. "You people think you can just invade my property without permission." Before I could answer, Veronica approached with the same calm confidence she carried into every room. "Mr. Holden," she said evenly, "your daughter granted us full access. We're here with her authorization." "My daughter," he repeated, as if the word itself irritated him. "She doesn't have the authority to drag our family into some media circus." I felt heat crawl up my neck. "I didn't drag anyone. They're here for my work." He laughed sharply. "Your work? Since when does doodling in a spare room qualify as work worth filming?" The camera operator glanced at Veronica, silently asking whether to keep rolling. She gave a single nod. Dad noticed. "Oh no," he snapped. "You're not filming this. I demand you stop that camera. They're documenting the process," I said. "You don't get to control that." His eyes narrowed. "I'm your father. You don't talk to me like I'm one of your little projects." Mom stepped between us. "David, stop. You're upset. But this isn't helping." He pointed at her without looking away from me. "She doesn't see what's happening. None of you do. They're taking advantage of her, feeding her delusions. She's not the kind of person they feature on TV." He said it with certainty, like it was a natural law. Veronica stepped forward. "Actually, she is." Dad turned on her. "Excuse me, Avery's work has impressed multiple producers," she said. "Her adaptive grid could influence how municipalities manage energy consumption. We don't choose subjects randomly. We choose them because they matter." He stared at her, stunned for only a moment before regrouping. "She barely held a job. She can't even—" "Dad!" I said sharply. He froze, surprised by the interruption. "You don't get to belittle me in front of them. Not today. Not anymore." His shock flickered into anger. "So now you think you're above us, above family. That's what this industry does, fills your head with lies." "No," I said quietly. "You did that." The words hit him harder than any shout. Cole shifted uncomfortably. Mom clasped her hands tighter. Dad, refusing to show the blow, shoved a crumpled printout toward me. "This is what I got today. An email from the network asking for background information. I want to know about your childhood, your struggles, your obstacles. They're fishing for a sob story, and I won't let them turn me into the villain." The irony almost stunned me. "You've spent my entire life telling me who I'm not," I said. "Do you really think a camera crew needs to invent anything?" His expression flickered briefly, sharply, before hardening again. "They're not getting anything from me." "That's fine," I said. "They don't need you." He stepped closer until he was inches from me. "You're making a fool of yourself." "Let her speak for herself," Veronica said calmly. He rounded on her. "This is a family matter. She didn't back up. She's an adult, and she is the center of this project, not you." That was the moment something shifted, the moment he realized he was outnumbered not by people, but by facts, by reality, by the story unfolding without his permission. His voice dropped to a low, sharp edge. "You're going to regret this, Avery. You're getting caught up in something that will destroy you." I didn't flinch. "Then let me handle it." He studied me for a long, tense moment, searching for the version of me he used to control. When he didn't find it, something in him recoiled. Not anger, not disappointment, but fear. Without another word, he turned and walked toward his truck. Mom called after him. "David, please." He didn't answer. He got in, slammed the door, and sped down the street. The crew stayed frozen until the sound faded. Mom covered her face with both hands. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. He doesn't know how to handle change." I exhaled slowly, trying to ease the trembling in my hands. "It's not your fault." Cole, unusually quiet, cleared his throat. "Aves, you okay?" I looked at him. For the first time, he wasn't smug or dismissive, just concerned. "I will be," I said. Veronica stepped between us, her voice gentle now. "We can pause filming if you need a moment." "No," I said. "Let's keep going." "Are you sure?" "Yes." Because this was the part Dad never understood. Every time he tried to push me back into the box he built, he taught me how to break out of it faster. The crew resumed setting up equipment in the backyard. Mom lingered near the porch, watching me with a fragile mixture of pride and regret. When Veronica walked beside me toward the fence line for the next shot, she spoke quietly. "You handled that with more composure than most founders I've worked with." I didn't feel composed. "That's how I know you were," she said with a small smile. As the camera began rolling again, sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the yard like a stage being lit. I stood in front of the lens, shoulders squared, heart pounding, but steady. This was no longer just a segment. It was the beginning of the part of my story I controlled. And for the first time in my life, I didn't apologize for it. By the time the crew moved from the backyard to the side of the house, half the neighborhood had gathered at the end of the driveway. People leaned against fences, whispered behind their hands, pretended to be out watering plants just to stay close enough to watch. Mom kept stepping outside with a tray of lemonade she absolutely did not need to offer nerves, making her overly hospitable. Cole disappeared inside after Dad's outburst, but he stayed close enough to watch from the kitchen window. For once, the usual smirk was gone. We were about to film the technical breakdown of my model, something Veronica planned as the spine of the segment, when her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, then at me. "That was fast," she murmured. "What was the network wants to bump your feature from a short segment to a full-length profile? They want more footage, more depth, more everything." My heart stuttered. "Already?" She smiled. "You've struck a nerve with them. They think you're the kind of unexpected founder audiences root for." My pulse picked up. "So they want to film the prototype next?" "That's the plan," she said. "We'll walk through your design process, grab B-roll, then drive to the test site. Should take an hour." Before we could begin, a gray SUV pulled up to the curb. Mom tensed. "Do you know them?" A woman stepped out, polished, poised, dressed in the kind of business attire people wore on magazine covers. Her hair gleamed in the sunlight. A man followed her, tall, sharp-featured, the kind of person who built companies with frightening efficiency. Veronica's eyebrows lifted. "Oh, that's unexpected," Mom whispered. "Who are they, journalists, I guessed?" "No," Veronica said. "Bigger." The woman approached with a confident stride. "Are you Avery Holden?" she asked. "Yes," I answered cautiously. She held out her hand. "I'm Maren Cross, feature reporter with Global Spotlight Weekly." The name hit me like a shockwave. GSW wasn't just big, it was national respected, read by half the industry. "And this," she added, "is our editorial director, Nathan Hale." He nodded. "We saw the teaser." My voice wavered. "The teaser. It aired last night at 8:30. Nathan's expression didn't change. "We've already received inquiries from investors looking for more information. Your model caught attention." I blinked, stunned. "Before the full segment even airs?" "Yes." His tone was simple and professional. "Tech audiences respond fast to disruptive infrastructure design." Mom looked between them and me like she'd woken up in a different universe. Maren pulled a folder from her bag. "We're hoping to run a simultaneous feature with the network. A written profile on your work, your inspiration, and your goals. We'd like a tour of your workspace and a conversation about long-term vision." She paused, studying me. We're especially interested in how you built an operational system without institutional backing." I swallowed hard, heat rising in my cheeks. Veronica stepped in smoothly. Mare and Nathan were in the middle of filming, but I'm open to coordinating coverage if Avery is. Then she turned to me. "This is your call." For the first time, everyone waited for me to decide. My voice came out steady. "Yes, I'd like that." Maren beamed. "Wonderful. We'll stay out of the way until you're ready." As they retreated toward the sidewalk, whispering to each other excitedly, Mom turned to me in a kind of dazed wonder. "Avery, what exactly did you build?" I exhaled slowly. "Something useful." Her eyes softened. I wish we had known." I didn't say the words that hovered in my mind. "You could have known." Instead, I let the moment sit. Veronica clapped her hands once. "All right, let's get to work." The camera rolled again. We walked toward the small workbench Dad had built back when he believed Cole would be the engineer in the family. I stood where Veronica guided me while the boom mic hovered overhead. "Explain the shift node concept," she prompted. I spoke clearly, aware of how many ears were listening. "It works like a living grid. Instead of static pathways, it adjusts energy distribution based on usage patterns. Houses, office buildings, schools, they stop fighting for resources. The system listens, then responds." The operator zoomed in as I sketched the adaptive flow. Veronica nodded approvingly. "So, it prevents outages?" "Yes, and reduces waste. It creates stability for communities that can't afford major infrastructure upgrades." Behind us, I heard a muffled sound, Mom pressing a hand to her chest, as if she'd suddenly discovered something precious. We filmed for another 20 minutes before Veronica suggested a quick transition to the greenhouse test site. The crew began packing equipment into the van. Then another vehicle turned onto the street, a sleek black sedan tinted expensive. Mom whispered, horrified, "Please don't let it be your father, it's not." I said because Dad couldn't afford something with wheels that shiny. When the door opened, a man in a blazer stepped out, followed by a younger associate holding a leather portfolio. Both wore badges from a venture firm I recognized from Tech News, a firm that funded energy startups with deep pockets and high expectations. He approached with a purposeful stride. "Avery Holden," he asked. "I'm Rowan Pierce." My firm saw the teaser clip. My heart jumped. "The teaser is 10 seconds long." And 10 seconds was enough, he said. "We'd like to schedule a formal pitch meeting, soon, before the segment airs. Your design has real-world potential, and we don't want to lose the chance to speak with you first." Cole emerged onto the porch mid-sentence and nearly tripped when he heard the words, "pitch meeting." Rowan continued, "If your projections look anything like what we've seen, there may be a partnership opportunity or a full acquisition depending on your long-term goals." I felt every nerve in my body spark. "You're here," I said slowly, "because of my work." "Yes," he said simply, "because it's compelling." The yard fell silent. The crew watched, the neighbors watched, my family watched. All the people who'd believed I was drifting now realized I had never been standing still. I straightened, meeting Rowan's gaze. "I'm open to scheduling, but I'm not selling anything yet." He gave a slow smile. "Good. Founders who don't rush impress me. We'll be in touch." As he left, Veronica turned to me with a look I hadn't seen from her before, respect mixed with excitement. "You do realize," she said quietly, "that this is no longer just a feature. This is becoming a movement around you." A soft breeze swept across the lawn, carrying the murmurs of every person witnessing what happened next. For the first time in my life, the world wasn't telling me who I was. It was asking. By evening, the neighborhood had finally emptied out, though a few silhouettes still lingered behind curtains, as if afraid to miss whatever came next. The crew had headed back to the studio, promising to return the next morning for the greenhouse segment. Rowan's business card remained in my pocket, its clean edges digging into my palm every time I moved. Maren and Nathan had left too, planning a follow-up interview after reviewing my notes. The house felt stretched thin, with tension quiet, but not peaceful. Mom hovered near the kitchen island, fidgeting with a clean rag she didn't need. Cole paced the hallway, glancing at the front door every few seconds. None of us said the obvious. Dad wasn't home yet. When the sun dipped low enough to stain the windows orange, his truck finally turned into the driveway. Mom froze mid-swipe, the cloth dangling uselessly from her fingers. Cole muttered, "Here we go," under his breath. Dad slammed the door harder than necessary and walked inside, his boots heavy on the hardwood. The smell of dust and engine oil followed him in. He looked tired, angry, yes, but also worn down in a way I'd never seen. His gaze landed on me immediately. "Your little stunt today?" He began shrugging off his jacket. Did exactly what I knew it would. Mom spoke quickly, hoping to calm him. "David, please." He shook her off. "No, she needs to hear this." I crossed my arms. "All right, I'm listening." He pulled a folded paper from his pocket and tossed it onto the kitchen table. "My supervisor called. Apparently I'm now the topic of conversation at the depot. Everybody saw the teaser. Everybody heard that reporters were asking me for comments about your genius rebellion." Cole winced. "Dad." He ignored him. "Do you have any idea how humiliating it is to be painted like some backwards father who tried to hold his daughter down?" I stared at him. "No one painted anything. They asked for context." "I know what that means," he snapped. "They want a villain and I'm convenient. It's not about you," I said quietly. He scoffed. "Everything becomes about me when you get involved." That one landed harder than I expected. Mom stepped forward. "David, you're spiraling. You're taking this out of proportion." "Am I?" he demanded. "Or am I finally seeing what's happening? Cameras in my yard, reporters on my driveway, investors showing up like this are Silicon Valley, and all because she needed attention." My jaw clenched. I didn't ask for any of them to show up. "You didn't have to," he retorted. "You made yourself a spectacle." His voice grew sharper. "And now people are talking about us, about me, like we're some cautionary tale. The father who didn't believe in his daughter, the family she had to rise above. They're painting me as the reason you're whatever it is you're pretending to be." Cole rubbed the back of his neck. "Dad, maybe don't say it like that." "No," Dad barked. "She needs to understand the damage she's done." "What damage?" I asked. "Because I finally chose myself." His expression hardened. "Because you made me look small." Something inside me broke. "You did that," I said softly. "Not me." Mom inhaled sharply. Dad blinked, thrown off by my tone. "What is that supposed to mean?" "It means," I said, steadying myself, "that you spent years telling me I wasn't enough, that I wasn't smart enough or practical enough or stable enough. And now that people outside this house see value in me, you're angry. Not because they're wrong, but because they're right." He took a step toward me. "Watch your mouth." "No," I said. For the first time I didn't back down, not an inch. "You told me I'd never be someone," I continued, "and maybe that made sense to you because it kept things simple. Cole was the capable one. I was the fragile one. You never had to change, never had to learn who I actually was." His face twisted. "I know exactly who you are." "You don't," I said. "But the world is starting to." Mom touched his arm. "David, listen to her." He jerked away. "I don't need a lecture from either of you." "Then, hear a fact," I said. "You don't get to define me anymore." Silence dropped heavy and absolute. Dad stared at me like something had rewired in front of him, like he couldn't reconcile the daughter he'd built in his mind with the woman standing in his kitchen, unafraid of him for the first time. He turned abruptly, grabbed his jacket, and marched toward the front door. Mom called after him, panic edging her voice. "Where are you going?" He paused, back rigid. "Out. Anywhere but here." The door slammed, rattling the frame. Mom pressed her palms to her forehead. "Oh, God." Cole exhaled hard, sinking into a chair. "He's not used to being wrong. This is hitting harder than he'll admit." I leaned against the counter, adrenaline fading into exhaustion. "He'll come around someday. Or he won't." Mom looked at me, then really looked at me like she was seeing a person she hadn't taken the time to study in years. "You didn't provoke him," she whispered. "You spoke the truth." I swallowed. "I'm done shrinking so he can feel tall." She stepped toward me, hesitated, then pulled me into a tight embrace. "I'm proud of you," she said, voice trembling. I closed my eyes. "Thank you." A soft buzz vibrated in my pocket. I pulled out my phone. A new email from Veronica tomorrow. We're filming at the prototype site. Also, the network has requested a live interview next week. You're becoming the centerpiece of our season. Rest tonight. Big day ahead. I stared at the words as they sank in. Mom touched my elbow. Everything's happening fast, isn't it? It is, I said. Are you scared? A little? She nodded. But you're not alone. Not anymore. The house felt different then, not lighter, not yet, but shifting like old foundations were finally breaking open, letting in air. Cole glanced at me, his voice uncharacteristically soft. Avis, you're really doing this? Yeah, I said, I am. And as the night settled thick and humming with possibilities, one truth finally took shape. My father's world had fractured, but mine was just beginning to rise. The next morning arrived with a fog that clung low to the ground, muting the world into soft gray. Veronica texted just after 7. We're on our way. Be ready to walk us through the full prototype. This is the big one. My stomach fluttered not from fear, but from the weight of what the day meant. Everything we filmed so far had been pieces. Today we were showing our hearts. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table while the house remained quiet. Mom padded in wearing a robe, hair still damp from the shower. She didn't speak at first. She just poured herself a cup and sat across from me like she was trying to memorize the moment. You didn't sleep much, she said gently. Too much on my mind. She nodded. Your father didn't come home last night. I froze mid-sip. At all, no. She set her mug down carefully. I called him twice, straight to voicemail. This should have broken me, but instead it felt like a confirmation of something I already knew. He wasn't avoiding me out of anger. He was avoiding me because he didn't know how to look at the version of me he could no longer control. Mom reached across the table and squeezed my hand. No matter what he does today, don't let him take this from you. Before I could respond, the distinctive rumble of the crew van echoed up the street. Cameras, lights. Veronica's voice directs people before the engine even shuts off. Mom gave my hand one last squeeze and rose to answer the door. The fog began lifting as we drove toward the prototype site, an old maintenance lot on county-owned land that I had unofficially adopted years ago. I'd built early versions of my model here, hidden behind stacks of discarded pallets and rusted equipment. As we approached the edges of my past, met with the sheer scale of the present. The crew fanned out through the lot, unpacking tripods and cables, preparing the ground for what Veronica called the centerpiece of the episode. Where do you want me? I asked. Right where you've always been, she said. Beside the work. I stepped toward the fenced-off corner where my prototype sat, a cluster of modular panels, micronodes and batteryless converters built from salvaged parts and late-night tenacity. Seeing it lit by professional equipment felt surreal. The boom mic lifted. The camera focused. Veronica gestured for me to begin. So I did. I knelt beside the central node fingers, brushing the metal casing. This is where the system reads energy demand. It reacts in real time. Instead of relying on outdated infrastructure, it maps usage and shifts supply before outages happen. The cameraman circled slowly, capturing every angle. And this? Veronica asked. What's its role? I moved to the next module. Surge absorption. It protects the grid from spikes, so neighborhoods aren't punished for using electricity at the same time. The words flowed easily, not rehearsed, lived. Mom watched from behind a caution barrier, clutching her coat against the breeze. Cole stood beside her, hands shoved in his pockets, an expression I couldn't quite read. Pride, confusion, maybe even awe. Halfway through the walkthrough, a familiar engine growled up the gravel road. Dad's truck. Veronica glanced at me. Do you want us to cut? No, I said quietly. Keep going. Dad parked crooked again. He got out, eyes fixed on the equipment, the microphones, the prototype, the lights, the crew. Finally on me. He looked exhausted, eyes rimmed, red shoulders tight, jaw clenched. Mom stepped forward cautiously. David. He brushed past her without a word. I stayed kneeling by the prototype, refusing to shrink. Dad stopped a few feet away. What is this? he asked, voice low but trembling. "What exactly is this?" "This," I said, "is what I've been building." He scanned the equipment, the modules, the humming power distribution map on my tablet. The confusion in his eyes wasn't the dismissive kind he used to wield. It was real raw, almost disorienting. "You built all this?" he asked. "Yes. By yourself. I had guidance from professors and mentors online, but the design is mine." He stepped closer, brow furrowing. "Why didn't you ever tell me it was this serious?" I stood fully. "Because I tried. And every time I did, you told me to stop dreaming. You told me I wasn't capable, that I didn't understand the real world." He took a step back, as if the truth carried physical force. "That's not what It is," I said softly. "You said it with words, with silence. Every time you compared me to Cole, with every time you told me I'd never be someone." His throat bobbed. Mom stood behind him, tears gathering. Cole looked like he wanted to disappear. Dad blinked hard gaze, suddenly unfocused, like the ground had shifted beneath him. "I thought I was protecting you," he whispered. My breath caught. He continued, voice breaking in places I'd never heard before. "I pushed because I was afraid of being proved wrong, of being the one who didn't understand. I thought if I minimized the things that scared me, your ideas, your dreams, you wouldn't get crushed by disappointment." "That wasn't protecting me," I replied. "It was limiting me." The crew had stopped moving. No cameras pointed at him out of respect, but every eye was watching. He wiped a hand over his face. "I didn't know how to handle a daughter who wasn't like me, or like your brother. I didn't know what to do with someone who dreamed bigger than our world made room for." I felt my throat tighten, but kept my spine straight. "You didn't have to understand me. You just had to believe me. Believe you." His voice wavered. "Avery, I didn't even believe in myself enough to do that." The confession landed like a weight I didn't realize I'd been carrying for years. He looked around at the setup, the cameras, the investors who had shown up uninvited the day before the prototype, glowing softly beneath the morning sun. "I saw the teaser," he admitted, "and I watched it again and again, and I realized you weren't reaching for attention. You were reaching for impact." I didn't speak. He swallowed hard. "I don't know how to fix what I broke. I don't know how to undo years of thinking I was helping when I was hurting you." A faint breeze moved over the gravel path. No one on the crew spoke. Even their footsteps softened as the moment settled in. Dad took one more step toward me, voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm here now. And if you'll let me, I want to learn who you really are." My heartbeat thudded painfully. Not victory and revenge, just the truth. And for the first time, he wanted it too. The house felt strangely hollow for a place that had just been filled with camera crews and booming lights. Equipment cases snapped shut in quick practiced motions. Cords curled neatly into bins. Soft conversations echoed as the production team wrapped their final tasks. One of the producers gave me a warm, almost reverent nod before she powered down her monitor. "Avery," she said quietly, "today's footage. It might end up defining this season." My family hovered a few feet behind me, Dad rigid as stone, Mom wringing her hands, Cole shifting from foot to foot like he wanted to disappear and apologize at the same time. They didn't know how to stand in the same room with me now. It was the first time any of them had seen me fully without shrinking or apologizing. The host stepped back inside, calm as always, her composure almost surreal after a day like this. "Before we finish," she said, touching my arm lightly, "I'd love a closing segment. Just a few questions. The audience will want to hear your reflection while the truth is still fresh." The crew reset the room in seconds. A soft key light illuminated the massive city-facing windows, tinting the skyline gold as dusk settled over the home. They placed a simple chair at an angle, clean, bare, honest, perfect. She sat opposite me. "Avery, what cut deepest? The sabotage, the deepfake, losing your job, everything you exposed today." My breath caught, though my voice stayed steady. "It wasn't the company," I said. "It wasn't even Martin. The worst emotional pain I've ever carried was hearing my own father tell me I would never be someone." Behind me, Mom inhaled sharply. Cole's shoe dragged quietly across the floor. Dad didn't flinch, but I could feel the tension radiating from him like heat off pavement. The host nodded, guiding me further. "And what did that do to you?" I stared directly into the camera, no running, no softening. It made me believe I only existed in the shadows of other people's expectations. I lived small for so long. But the night I was fired, I stopped shrinking. I started building Greenset for myself, not to prove anything, not to win approval, just because the work mattered and I mattered. The second camera shifted, framing the family behind me. No editing tricks, no curated lighting, every emotion was visible. Avery, the host, continued after everything you revealed today. What does success look like now? For the first time all day, I felt the truth rise without resistance. Success has a purpose, I said. Not titles, not applause, not someone else's version of worth. Purpose, nothing more. The entire room fell still. It wasn't empty silence, it was recognition. Then the host turned toward Mom. "Mrs. Holden, would you join us?" Mom's voice trembled even before she stepped forward. "I failed her," she whispered. "I let fear choose for me. And I'm sorry, Avery, I truly am." Before I could reply, the host faced Dad. "And you, Mr. Holden. Today the world heard you say your daughter would never be someone. What does this moment mean to you now?" Dad stepped into the light like it burned. His voice wavered. "I didn't push her to be better," he said. "I pushed because I was afraid of being left behind and being proved small. I knew she was going to surpass everything I ever did. And I didn't know how to handle that. I was wrong. I was cruel. And I'm ashamed." No one moved. No one breathed. The camera held every fracture in his voice. A producer hurried over and whispered into the host's ear. Her eyes widened. "We just received confirmation," she announced. "The SEC has opened a formal investigation into Martin Hale. Your evidence reached them already." A release of tension left my body so suddenly it almost hurt. Relief didn't taste like victory, it tasted like oxygen. When filming wrapped for good and the last case clicked shut, the house finally sank into a startling, unfamiliar quiet. I walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city below sparkled alive and humming. Mom came to stand beside me. "We should have done better," she whispered. "I hope it isn't too late to learn." I didn't respond immediately. Some apologies are seeds, they need time to sprout. Dad approached next, stopping one cautious step away. "I don't deserve forgiveness," he said softly, "but I'm trying to become someone you don't have to hide from." It wasn't everything, but it was something. Later in my upstairs workspace, I opened my laptop. A new email glowed at the top of my inbox, Green Horizon Fund proposal to build an ecotech research campus under the direction of Avery Holden. I paused, letting the words settle deep into the part of me that once believed obscurity was my destiny. Outside, the rooftop terrace beckoned. I stepped into the cool night air, the wind brushing against my face, city lights flickering. This wasn't the night the world made me someone. It was the night I finally recognized myself. I was never meant to fit inside their definition of success, I murmured into the dark. I was meant to build a world shaped by my own. Then I faced the invisible audience I knew would hear this someday. If anyone has ever told you that you'll never be someone, don't let that be your ending. Let it be the moment you start rising. Tell me what time you're listening right now. And if you want more stories like this, stay with me. I have so many more to share.